Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here to start a new series ranking the units of Total War Rise of Mordor, going by unit type. If you're new to this channel, Total War Rise of Mordor is a mod for the game Total War Attila, the mod linked in the description below of course. A mod that I absolutely love to make videos about and can't wait to see released in its final form. As I said before, I'm going to be ranking units by their type overall, instead of going by top 10s, looking at their quality, availability, statistics, and impact on the battlefield to determine their ranking compared to their peers, with the charts that I use to compare their qualities being shown at the end of the video. In this video in particular, the unit type we're going to be looking at are unique generals. That is to say, general units that can lead armies that are one of a kind, be they a command unit or a unit led by heroes and villains from the books and films, as opposed to the more standard general options that can be used repeatedly in an army. All up, there are 12 units that fall into this category. However, because several of these units are exactly identical in terms of stats, only really being separate visually, these units have been grouped together, meaning that the units will be ranked from 9th place to 1st place in terms of how good they are as unique generals. Before we make it into the ranking itself, I want to make it clear that these are purely my opinions and of course are subjective, so if my rankings aren't the same as yours, don't be upset. Pushing that aside now, let's jump into the rankings. Coming in at 9th place, we have Dane Ironfoot of Erebor, leading his unit of Sons of the Mountain. While this unit does make for some very mighty shock troops, especially compared to the other unique generals in the mod, this unit is somewhat lacking, especially given that it's one of the few generals who aren't cavalry, meaning that it's automatically at a disadvantage in my eyes. While the unit does have the joint record for the largest unique general unit numbers, and has great melee attack and both a higher than average morale and missile block chance than most of its contemporaries, its price is too high for what it delivers in comparison to the other units on this list, and its health, the lowest on the list, makes it very fragile. Still a great unit, but among this company, competition is rough, so I have to rate it as dead last. In 8th place, we have the Bane of the Steppes, which, if you've been watching the channel for a while, might come as a surprise, given I typically laud shock cavalry generals as being amazing. While I generally do view them as superior units compared to shock infantry in the role of general, the Bane of the Steppes are very lackluster when it comes to their stats, especially for a gold tier 4 unit, one of the other units coming up in the video being roughly a match for them despite being far cheaper and being of a lower rank. Combined with the unit's relatively high price compared to other top tier shock cavalry units that outperform the Bane of the Steppes, it's only logical that it'd be near the bottom of the list, only really being better than Dane Ironfoot and his dwarves due to the inherent strengths of shock cavalry compared to shock infantry, such as speed and maneuverability. Moving on to 7th place, we have the second shock infantry general option, Kamal and the Black Easterling's retinue. As a general, I consider this unit superior to both Dane Ironfoot and the Bane of the Steppes, being roughly equivalent with the Sons of the Mountain in terms of stats such as unit number, having some slight advantages and disadvantages in areas. However, when it comes to morale, Kamal and his unit share the highest morale stats in the game with another unit, possessing almost 5 times as much morale as the closest other potential general unit. What this means is that when deploying Kamal as your general, you essentially get Dane Ironfoot, but with the benefit of being a practically unbreakable unit, leading to a unit that will literally fight to the last man, something that can't be said for Dane Ironfoot or the Bane of the Steppes. It's this unbreakable morale that makes me consider this unit superior to the previous ones, the Bane of the Steppes, and their greater impact on the battlefield not being enough to sway the rankings in their favour. Going up to 6th place, we find ourselves discussing Ayama and the Knights of the Mark. Unique among all the units being looked at today, this is the only silver tier 3 unit being ranked, the same one that I referred to earlier being a match for the Bane of the Steppes despite being far cheaper. As a shock cavalry unit, while Ayama and his men are somewhat of a downgrade compared to some of the more elite cavalry in the mod, the unit still performs well as a budget general, where I believe its strength lies, being capable of doing a lot of damage for a relatively cheap price, while still retaining the ability to avoid enemy threats, a hallmark of a good general unit in my opinion. The cheapest general we've looked at today, I consider Ayama and the Knights of the Mark a good general unit, but one that is still outclassed by others yet to be seen. In 5th place, I've tied the regular Nasgul leading the Servants of the Eye and the Witch King leading the Servants of the Eye. Both of these units are identical to each other when it comes to stats, the only difference being a visual change between their officers, which I don't warrant as big enough a change to have the units be separate on this list. Added to that, the Nasgul-led Servants of the Eye are a unit that's shared across 2 faction rosters, being potential generals for both Mordor and Dol Guldur, so just keep that in mind. Heavy melee cavalry, the Nazgul were quite expensive, even when compared to other general units, with their status as melee horsemen meaning they're lacking on the charge compared to dedicated shock cavalry, leading to a unit that doesn't devastatingly make back its money the way other units can, via breaking enemy armies with charges. Instead, the unit is good at fighting and holding the line against other cavalry, being a dedicated killer of stuck shock cavalry with a defense stat twice that of most other cavalry. While it may seem odd that I've given such a unit which doesn't really stand out such a high rank, stats wise, the Nazgul are roughly middle of the pack, being effective horsemen and generals to a degree greater than the previous units, while not being as effective as the units placed above them. Taking 4th position are the Black Riders, one of the most unique units overall in the game. A heavy melee cavalry unit comprised solely of the 9 Nasgul. The unit is the smallest in the mod, while still retaining the significant price of the previous unit, being tied for the second most expensive general in the game. With such a small amount of warriors in a unit, while it's obvious that the unit doesn't possess the raw strength of other melee cavalry units, let alone shock cavalry, the unit can surprisingly do a lot of damage and stay in battle almost indefinitely, despite always being outnumbered. The reason for this is because just like Kamal and his Black Easterlings retinue, the Black Riders have the highest morale stat in the game, also making them invulnerable, leading to a unit that can literally be swamped by enemies and continue cutting them down. Combined with the highest defense, armor, and health of any general unit, the Black Riders make for a tank almost impervious to enemy attacks, making them quite the unique unit, this legendary toughness gifting them the 4th position. Moving into the top 3, we'll start at bronze place by looking at the Elven King's Riders. The most expensive general being looked at today, this heavy command unit is on the smaller side when it comes to unit size, being the second smallest apart from the Black Riders with their strength of 9 Nazgul. While not as hard hitting on the charge as proper shock cavalry, the Elven King's Riders can still deal out a lot of damage, while their health, second only to the spectral Black Riders, makes them a very tough unit to bring down. Their high morale and the highest speed of any unit in the game making for a swift unit which when used properly can run circles around an enemy. It's primarily due to these high stats and the strengths they imbue this unit with that I give it 3rd place. Coming in for the silver medal, we have the Rivian Regents. A unit when looking at their stats surprised me due to how good they are as shock cavalry, despite not actually being shock cavalry, instead being heavy command cavalry. What this means is that when using the Rivian Regents as a general unit, you're gaining access to command cavalry who can do as much damage as dedicated shock cavalry units, performing just as well in melee, a great strength for the unit which is reflected in its price, being on the more expensive side compared to its competitors in the list. It's this versatility on the battlefield that gives the Rivian Regents such a high ranking. However, there's another unit that I believe to be superior to it. In joint 1st place, we have King Theoden and his Knights of the House of Eorl, as well as Prince Theodred, leading his own contingent of Knights of the House of Eorl, both units sharing the exact same stats and abilities, the only real difference between the two being graphical. Relatively cheap units in comparison to their competitors, both of these units make for superb shock cavalry generals which can trounce other shock cavalry units in battle, easily possessing enough power to turn the tides of battle when necessary. Overall, I consider both units to be the most balanced generals, a perfect mix of strength, speed, and low cost, making for amazing units. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you disagree with my rankings, please let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear what your opinions are. If you have enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, I'd really appreciate it. I'm going to continue this series, however, I will almost definitely be making the switch to other mods and games for Total War in the future. Stick around to the end of the video if you want to see my charts comparing the units. This is your host Jakov, signing out.